Hey everyone, today we are sewing up the Unagi wristlet from Sincerely Jen Patterns as part of the Marathon Sewciety event. This is a really quick pattern to put together, so in addition to sewing up the pattern as it is written, I'm also going to show you how to add a row of card slots to your bag. It's assumed that you have all of your pattern pieces cut and interfaced per the instructions, but if you want to do the card slots on the inside, then you will substitute the solid back lining piece, which is this shape in the pattern, with the card slot pieces that I will provide measurements for. I have substituted the second layer of woven interfacing with fusible fleece that I've kept out of the seam allowance on my exterior back and my lower exterior front section. And I've also pre-punched the holes in my fleece so I can see the marks for my decorative rivets. I have my wristlet strap cut to be 3 inches wide and 14 inches long, as that's my preferred measurements for a wristlet strap, but you can use the measurements in the pattern if you wish. And I'm also going to be using press grommets in the place of a screw-in grommet or a steering connector for my finished pouch. The pattern is available from the Sincerely Jen website. I will put the link in the video description for you. So let's get going. The first thing I'm going to do is sew up my wristlet strap. So I have my interfaced cotton woven material and I'm going to fold it in half long ways and then press along that fold. You can use a seam roller or an iron to make that crease. And then you're going to fold the long raw ends to meet the line from that fold in the center to fully enclose those raw outside edges. You can draw a line down the center of your strap if that helps you when placing that second fold. If you're using a thicker material, I recommend leaving a small gap in between your raw edges so that when you fold it over to make your completely enclosed wristlet strap, you don't have bulk at the outside edge. Fold that over again. And then I am going to iron this to keep it nice and flat, making sure that my raw edges are evenly tucked in and that the folded edges are lined up nicely. With that wristlet strap all pressed, I can now go and sew it together. I am using a gate ring for my wristlet, so I don't actually have to slide that on now. I can sew this together and then just put the strap through the opening in the gate ring. But if you were using a swivel hook on your wristlet strap, you're going to want to put your hardware on first. So I'm going to show you that way. Just slide your hardware on, bring your short raw edges up to meet at the end, and then fold it open, lining up the short raw edges and matching up the folds as best you can. And what we're going to do is sew along this edge at 3/8 of an inch, and then we will fold the strap back up and top stitch around the entire outside all in one go, creating a continuous loop with no raw ends. So we're going to head over to the machine and I'll show you how to do that. I've placed some clips to keep my edges lined up, and I'm just going to sew straight down here, back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Once you've sewn that first seam, remove your clips. We're going to fold that seam open, and then you're going to fold in your raw edges. You can trim those threads at the side. Fold the folded seam towards the center, and I'll just place a clip there to keep it in place. Do the same on the other side, making sure that it's staying nice and flat. And then you're going to fold it over again and line up where the seam is. Then fold your strap. If you just pull on it slightly and you've got a good crease, and it should tuck in like this. Your raw edges are remaining hidden inside, and clip around the open edge. And now we're going to sew all the way around this loop. If you have done a narrower strap, you can choose to top stitch just on the open side. If you have done a wider strap where you prefer how it looks, you can top stitch one side and then top stitch the other side. Keeping your hardware out of the way, make sure that it looks nice and even. I like to start around the area where the joint is, as that is where I will end up placing my hardware, and I like to keep the bulk out of the way. I'm going to use a longer stitch length, and I'm just sewing straight down this open edge at 1/8 of an inch. I am not going to back stitch. I will keep long tails that I will then pull through to one side, tie off, and then tuck through the open edge. Check you're happy with your tension. Sometimes you need to increase it a little if you're going through a lot of layers. And just continue to slide your hardware out of the way and remove those clips as you go. I like to pull my tails through before I join back up at the beginning of my stitch line so that they don't get tangled in the second stitches as they come up here. Pull all those through to one side. And then keeping that out of the way, I'm going to sew along this side. Again, starting with long tails and sewing all the way around, this time with the folded edge. I like to pull all those threads through to one side. That will be the back of my strap. I'm going to tie a knot, bundling those threads together, and then I will use a needle to tuck it between the layers of my wristlet strap. Poke it in through the stitch line and then back out through the stitch line. And do the same thing for this bundle. And just snip that bundle of threads close to where your material is. I like to fold my wristlet strap around my hardware at the level of where that seam is, making sure that my bundles and my knots are on the inside. I fold it over so that that little bit of bulk at the joint is just past where my hardware is. And then I'm going to punch a hole on the outside of that seam to place a rivet. If you don't want to use a rivet, you can sew along this edge to secure your hardware in place. When you punch your hole, make sure that you are not punching through your stitch line. And just make sure that where your knots are is going to be hidden on the inside of that fold. You can kind of get a feel for where the bulk will sit the most flat. And I like to have the bulk just beyond where my hardware is. Punching that hole in the middle of the strap, steering clear of the join. You place a rivet and then set the rivet, making sure that when you do, you feel the 2 clicks so that you know that it is properly compressed inside of the cap. Now that that wristlet strap is complete, we can work on the optional card slots. I figured out a bit of a system for adding the 3 vertical card slots to a lining pattern piece, and I will put the rough formula in the description for you. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I will tell you that for the medium-sized Unagi wristlet, I am using a piece from my card slots that is 7 7/8 inches wide and 12.5 inches tall. And my side pieces are 1.5 inches wide and the height of my pattern piece. The first thing that you're going to do is flip over your card slot piece, and if you have a directional piece of fabric, you want the print to be facing this way. Take your ruler and a pen, and you're going to draw a line that is 5 3/4 of an inch down from the top. And a second line below that, that is 2 3/4 of an inch from the first line. Or 8.5 inches down. from the top. Take your scissors and you're going to put a very tiny snip at the level of those lines, only about 1/8 of an inch. And those lines are drawn on the back of your material. You're now going to fold the top line, which is the one that is 5 3/4 of an inch down, on the line that you just drew. The little snips will help you to make that fold at the exact point. And then you're going to crease that on the line. Take your lower half and you're going to fold it so that the right side is facing out on that line. And again, the little snips will help you to make that fold. It's tricky sometimes when you're doing card slots to get the fold on the line when you have drawn the line on the back for a fold that is facing out. So the little snips just help the fabric to sit where you want it to. And press that crease. So now you have a crease at the top here, and then you have a crease at the bottom. The reason that the card slots are so far down this piece is because of where the opening of the Unagi wristlet is. If you are doing a bag that opens at the top, you're not going to want to position these lines quite so far down. But for the purposes of this pattern, where the opening is partway down the front, you want to position them further down the bag, but not so far down that they're going to get caught in the bottom. Before we go any further, just check that you're happy with the depth. And also compare the height of this folded piece with the height of your completed exterior panel. And I have purposely got a little bit of overhang here, as I find sometimes with card slots, it is tricky to get the exact measurement. And I prefer to have a little bit of overhang I can trim later than have my piece come up too short. And the last thing to check is that your line is straight here and straight at the bottom. I'm now going to go and just press this with my iron, and then I can top stitch this upper fold. Fold the back part out of the way so that you just have the single fold here. You can backstitch in the side seam and sew straight across that folded edge and backstitch again at the other end. Fold the back part back up, and we are going to baste these side folds. Sewing along this part where the material is folded up to make the card slot, using a longer stitch length at 1/8 of an inch. I prefer to sew from the fold up, which means on one side I sew it on the front and on the other side I sew it on the back to make sure that the fold stays nice and straight. With all of those layers sewn together, I'm going to measure my card slots. I'm going to draw a line that is 2 3/4 of an inch from the outside edge on the back of my material. And the same on the other side. And then I'm going to check the size of this gap in the middle, and it should be 2 3/8 of an inch, which it is. We are going to adjust the height to the finished pattern piece. So grab your exterior piece and trim the lower edge of your card slot piece. You can also use the pattern piece as a guide. You're just going to line up the upper edge of your card slots with the straight edge of your pattern piece and just trim that to be the correct height. You can use a rotary cutter to trim that. I am using scissors because I am not on my cutting mat right now. We can now sew the card slot pieces. When I sew my card slots, I am going to backstitch here at the side, pivot, sew up this line. I can feel where the top of my card slot is at the front there, so I'm just going to draw a little line there. All of these marks are on the back of the material. And then I will backstitch at the top here to reinforce that opening. Sew all the way up, pivot to sew along the top here within the seam allowance, come back down, backstitch on the lower side of that line, come along this edge, and then backstitch again at the side. And that will give me one continuous line of stitches with the reinforcing stitches here and here on the card slots. If you prefer to work on the front of your material, you can draw those lines in with a removable pen on the front or use painter's tape. As you come down here, make sure that your card slot piece is not catching. Make sure that the lower edges are not caught and the upper edges are not caught. Trim your threads and then using double-sided tape or clips, attach the side panels, lining up the upper edge and the side. Just check that your center card slot is wide enough. And now we're going to sew down these edges at 3/8 of an inch. We're then going to fold those side panels open and top stitch along the fold. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Press both of those side panels open, folding the main part of the side panel over the seam allowance, keeping that seam allowance underneath the side panel, not underneath your card slots. And press that, and then we will top stitch down that edge. Before top stitching, you can take a small snip at the corner where the join is, just to reduce bulk in the top and the bottom seams. Making sure to stay about 1/8 of an inch away from your seam line. Because of the curved shape of the finished pattern piece in this pattern, I recommend back stitching within the seam allowance, just in the line of your stitches, not pivoting at the side like I did, as when we trim the final shape of the bag, you will cut those reinforcing stitches off. Double check all of your card slots. And when you're happy, use your pattern piece to trim this down to the size of the back lining panel, making sure that your piece is centered so that you have an equal spacing on either side of those card slots, and also trim back the seam allowance at the side here to about 1/8 of an inch. Take your 2 front pieces and your 2 lining front pieces, as well as your zipper tape. I'm going to be using double-sided tape to install my zipper, and you will also need a pen and a ruler. On the back of your main pieces, draw in your seam allowance for your zipper, just drawing that seam allowance line parallel to the angled edge of your exterior front pieces. Working first with the exterior top piece, place double-sided tape along the edge. Take your zipper tape, and if you have a preference to which way your zipper teeth face, make sure that it is positioned correctly. I like to have my teeth point towards the pull, and the pull will be at this side. You can also put the pull at that side if that is your preference. It is on the left in the pattern. Remove the backing from the double-sided tape and place that piece directly down on your zipper. I have cut mine 1/4 of an inch wider than the measurement given in the pattern, but if you have cut yours exactly, then you want to make sure that the line that you drew for your seam allowance does not cross over the edge of your zipper. And you want to line up the raw edge of your zipper with the raw cut angled edge of your exterior panel. And press that in place. Sew the zipper to the exterior top panel along the line that you drew, using a shorter stitch length and back stitching at the beginning and at the end. One of the trickier parts of this pattern is getting the sides of your front panel to line up because of the angled zipper. So before we sew the lining pieces on, we're going to make sure that we have our side seams properly lined up. So we are not going to attach the back to this zipper just yet. We are going to fold that zipper tape under. We are going to press it folded, but we are not going to top stitch it yet. You can use some double-sided tape to help keep that flattened out of the way. I prefer to use removable double-sided tape as it will be easier to attach the lining if I pull this tape out of the way. It's just going to help keep that upper section out of the way while we position the lower section. So we need to have this lower section line up perfectly with the upper section so that our side seams match up nicely. So you want that to be nice and straight there. We've drawn in our seam allowance here, and we want to make sure that the point where the seam allowance comes to the edge of our lower panel lines up with the edge here. So one way to do that is to take your ruler and you're going to draw a line that comes straight down the edge. Now that can be a little tricky to do because there's not a lot of material to work with, but you can use your other pattern piece as a guide. And when you have your piece lined up with your zipper tape, you can see that there's this little bit of overhang here. So you just want to draw a line on your zipper tape right here at the outside edge. And then when you place this section down, you want the flat edge lined up with the flat edge here, and you want this point where your seam allowance is drawn in to meet up with the line that we just drew. And then you can press that zipper tape in place. So it's slightly angled, the same as the zipper is slightly angled, and it lines up pretty well with this straight edge here. Another way to make sure that you're getting the placement right is to just draw that seam allowance that you're using on the back of your zipper tape just at the very edge there, and then you can line that up with the outside edge of your exterior lower piece. So you want where that line is to be right where the zipper crosses over with the exterior bottom. When you're happy, place double-sided tape on the angled edge of your exterior bottom piece and position it onto your zipper. You're placing the right side of your material down on top of the teeth, lining up those marks. Starting at one end and then pressing it gently down, keeping it nice and flat, not stretching that zipper tape at all. Before we sew that, I like to check by loosely folding that up to see approximately where the seam will be and make sure that it is straight. And if it is not quite straight, and you can see here I've just overshot a little, then you can reposition. Press it down again, adjusting until you get it lined up. And when we sew, the stitch line will be here. So you can brace that here, fold that over, and then you can see if the edge will be lined up. And that looks pretty good. So we can sew that line of stitches and make sure that that edge is lined up also. Sewing this the same way on the seam allowance line that we drew. You can do a row of basting stitches first if you want to, and then double check before sewing at your shorter stitch length. Fold that open, and we'll press that down to make sure that it all lines up. Press that back away from the zipper and check that the sides are straight. And also check that the height of your exterior front is the same as the height of your exterior back. If you have taken a slightly greater seam allowance, your piece may be too short, in which case you can undo those seams and resew them, or you can just make sure that when you sew your bag together, you center your panel up on the exterior so that the area that is too short falls within your seam allowance. If you use 5/16 of an inch rather than 3/8 of an inch, then you will find that you will be more likely to have the correct finished size of your front panel. Now that we're happy with the sides being straight, we can attach our lining pieces. Fold back open the top section, remove that double-sided tape. And now we're just going to line up the edges and then sew that again. Place your double-sided tape along the angled edge. We'll do the top first and then the bottom. We are going to line up the corner of our exterior top with the corner of our lining top piece. Match that up. Match it up at the other end also, and then press that in place. Press that down. I'm going to be sewing almost directly on top of this stitch line, maybe just ever so slightly inside. I don't want to sew on the outside as I'm already happy with the height and the sides. So I don't want to do anything that's going to mess with that. So I'm going to sew just ever so slightly inside, if not directly on top of the line that we first placed there to install the zipper. Fold both of those top sections well out of the way, and you can use double-sided tape or press them to keep them away from the zipper. Placing a couple of clips at the top edge can also help. And then we're going to repeat that for the lower half. Take the second lining piece, the lower section, remove the double-sided tape, and then you are placing it right sides down on the back of the zipper, lining up the edge of your exterior bottom, and lining up the other edge also, matching up the exterior pieces, not worrying about lining up with the edge of the zipper, and then pressing it along so that the long edge of the zipper, the long edge of the exterior lower section, and the lining are all lined up. And then again, sewing down here just inside that original stitch line. I'm now going to use double-sided tape to press all of those materials away from the zipper, making sure that I am placing my tape right up against the edge of my fabric so that I still have 1/8 of an inch to do my top stitching without sewing through the double-sided tape. I'm using 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape. And press that away, making sure I'm getting a nice crease there right at the seam line. Press that down. I like to pull on it, my material quite firmly to make sure that I'm getting a really good crease there and none of my material is bunching up at the fold. I'm now going to top stitch on either side of this zipper. I have not yet placed my zipper pull, and that is going to allow me to have a nice straight line on either side of my zipper, parallel to the fold. I'm going to start at the end, back stitch, sew all the way up, pivot again, and do the same on the lower side. If you're wanting to place the decorative rivets, you can punch the holes and place those now. I chose to do mine after installing the zipper so that they would not be in the way while I was doing that zipper install. You can get the markings from your pattern piece. If you are going to be adding the decorative rivets, I strongly recommend adding some kind of backing behind your rivet to support it, as it's just going through this thin exterior layer. Even though it's not weight bearing, it's just decorative, it's still a really good idea so that you don't get your rivet pulling through the exterior front of your bag. Double check that you're happy with all the placement before you set those. And I recommend using a shorter rivet since you're only going through one layer of material there. Take your zipper pull and we're going to place that now. Have a look at your zipper tape, and starting at the side that has the tooth further out, you're going to slide on your zipper pull. Making sure that the tape remains lined up the same way will mean that we don't have any bumps in our zipper tape. Slide that to about halfway, and if you like, you can sew at the ends here to make sure that that pull doesn't come off. We're now ready to finish assembling our wristlet. Working with 3 separate pieces, you have your combination front piece, which is the exterior and lining joined together. You have your interior or lining piece that may be just the solid panel, or it may be a card slot piece, and you also have your exterior back piece. We're going to make a mark at the bottom of our lining pieces. We're just going to make a mark that is in the center and about 3 inches wide, and that is going to be our turning hole. It doesn't have to be exact. And the other thing that you can do, if you like, is to fold up about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch as a memory seam, just at that section in the middle. Do the same on your back piece. It's important to layer your pieces in the correct order. So starting with your exterior front with the zipper panel facing up, take your exterior back and lay it right sides together with that exterior front. You're also going to want to open your zipper part of the way. Line up the top edges and the curves, making sure that you're getting all of the layers, the exterior front, the exterior front lining, and matching them all up. Clipping those 2 pieces together, the completed front section with the exterior and lining, with the exterior back, clipping all the way around, making sure to line up the curves and the straight edges. We're then going to sew around the entire outside of this piece, sewing through all of the layers, backstitching to reinforce at the end of the zipper, making sure we're keeping an even seam allowance all the way around. And we're going to be sewing around the whole piece using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, going all the way around using a shorter stitch length. I like to start on a straight edge. I will back stitch and then sew straight around, keeping all of those layers lined up. When I come to the curve, pivoting after every second stitch to keep it nice and gradual, and then using the edge of my presser foot on the straight side to get a nice straight seam in between the curves. Reinforce at the ends of the zipper. Good time to double check that your pull is on. You can draw in your curves to get a consistent seam allowance as you go around if you find sewing curves to be kind of tricky. Reinforce again at the other end of the zipper. Smoothing your layers out. Coming back up to where we started, back stitching again. Check that you have a nice consistent seam allowance all the way around, and I recommend using the exterior back piece for measuring your seam allowance rather than your lining piece, as the bulk of the zipper can cause the lining to pull away from the edge in some places. But if you use the back piece cut from the pattern piece, then you will get a much more even line. So you can double check that you're happy with that. And if you find that there are places that it's not quite exact, then you can correct that when we sew the second piece on. Trim any threads and then grab your back lining piece or the card slot piece if you made the card slots. And you want to place that piece face down on your lining. So if you've got the card slots, or if it's directional, you want to make sure that it's facing this way up and that the zipper is at the top. And you're going to place it right sides together. And you're going to clip that in place all the way around, the same way as when we piece together the exteriors. Once you have the second lining piece clipped to the rest of your project, the first thing that I like to do is just do a basting stitch using a loose, long stitch length at 1/8 inch all around the outside edge before we sew our actual seam line. And that way I know I'm not going to get any shifting before I sew the full seam. I have basted all the way around, even across the opening at the bottom, because I can just remove those stitches when we're done, but that will stop me getting any shifting. I've also transferred the markings of the opening to the other side, as I am going to sew with the exterior back up so that I can see where my previous stitch line is. And I've also gone around and just drawn in the 1/2 inch seam allowance so I can make sure that I'm getting a nice straight and consistent stitch line all the way around. And I'm also going to use this washer just to draw in the curve. And that's going to give me the best possible shape on my finished bag. I'm going to sew around the entire outside except for between these two markings inside of my original stitch line, keeping my seam as straight as possible, pivoting every couple of stitches at the curved corners to get a nice even shape for my bag. Starting at the bottom where the opening is, I'm going to back stitch about 1/2 inch beyond where my mark is, back stitch up to the mark, and then continue all the way around. I'm just going to grab my hump jumper here as there's a bit of bulk with the rivets, and I'm also going to reposition my needle to be in the middle as it's easier to see where my line is between the feet. of my presser foot. Sewing up to that mark, back stitching away from the mark, and then finishing off my tails about 1/2 inch from the opening. Take your scissors and you're going to place a snip just on the outside of those marks that marked the turning hole. And then you're going to trim all the way around the outside, leaving this section with the full seam allowance and also at the zipper. You can use pinking shears or make small snips into the corners to help the corners to turn out nicely. If you placed basting stitches along the opening, you can remove those as well. Fold up the lining to create a memory fold in the line of your seam, and then gently turn the entire bag out through the opening. It can be a little bit of a struggle, so just take your time and be patient. You don't need to fully poke out your corners yet. Your bag is still inside out. Just poke them out enough to get the bottom of your bag to lie nice and straight. With your wristlet still inside out, we need to close up this hole in the lining. You can sew along this edge using your sewing machine, or you can hand sew it closed. I am going to hand sew mine closed so that I have less of a ridge in the bottom of my bag and that it doesn't affect the outside bottom seam. Just using a lattice stitch, sewing the card slot lining piece or the solid lining piece to the lower edge of this lining piece, starting on the outside, sewing across and finishing at the other end. I am only going to be sewing through the linings. I am not sewing through the exteriors. Once you've sewn up the bottom, turn the bag out the rest of the way, gently pushing out the corners using a point turner to coax out the curve. Poke all of those corners out the best that you can, and then press or use your heat press without any heat to really flatten out those seams. The last thing for us to do now is to place our grommet. If you are going to do a riveted D-ring, or if you've done an inseam D-ring, then you can go ahead and do that. I am going to use a regular press style grommet. When you're using a gate ring or a swivel hook on your wristlet strap, you need to make sure that you can get around where your grommet is. Otherwise, you are going to struggle to actually use your wristlet strap. So I like to place my grommet and just mark where I want it to go. I'm keeping it clear of the bulk in the seam there. I'm just going to make the mark. And then I'm going to punch the hole for my grommet, and then I'm going to press that in place. Once you have your connector of choice installed, you can attach your wristlet strap. Opening it up, you can see that you've got your card slots here. You can see the reason why they need to be further down. If your opening was at the top, then you could place them higher, but for this one, they need to be a little bit further down. And there you have it. You're all done. This pattern comes in 3 different sizes. This is the medium size. As I mentioned, I'll make sure that the link is in the video description for you. Be sure to also check out the videos from my fellow Marathon Sewciety tutorialists so you can see all the different ways to sew up this bag pattern. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.